Welcome to the Education Blueprint. I'm Dr. Jon Rysewyk, Superintendent of Knox County Schools in Knoxville, Tennessee.
And I'm Prentice Elliott, a public school parent and your producer and co-host.
Prentice, today we're talking about early literacy.
I was trying to think back when I was a kid, and I know I learned how to read. I remember my parents reading to me. I remember the letters on the wall at school, but that's kind of about it. I think a lot of adults feel that way. You know, everybody learns to read, it seems like, but they may not know the specifics of how that happened.
Yeah, I think you're right. There's so few human experiences that everyone has. I think reading is one of those. Potty training, probably, that's one of those too, right, when you get into that. But we don't know how we learned it. We just learned it. And I think what we're going to speak to today is what it takes to read. It is very nuanced. It is very specific, what has to happen at what times. And to your point, people who learn to read or maybe are getting by may have a lot of gaps because they didn't understand all those pieces.
And across our district, teachers are utilizing concepts like the science of reading and high-quality instructional materials, concepts that we'll spend some time on today. But first, let's listen into a kindergarten reading lesson from Dogwood Elementary.
Read it and then write it. First build, then read, then write. The first word is has. Build the word has with your partner. So what we need to do, guys? Teamwork. Where's the teamwork at, right? So let's teamwork.
Okay. 8. No, she said has. Can I do this? This.
Very good. All right, and what word is that? Has. Can you write it?
There's a lot going on there, and luckily today we have a guest who can explain that complexity and some of the science behind it.
You're right. Our guest today is a native Knoxvillian with a deep background in education. She worked in Knox County Schools for 21 years as a special education teacher, an instructional coach, a principal, and an assistant superintendent. She's also served as director of Lebanon Special School District. She's now the president of Leadership Innovations Incorporated and a senior advisor to SCORE, which is the state collaborative on reforming education. They've done a lot of great work. So, Dr. Sharon Roberts, thanks for being here today.
Happy to be here, John.
Excited to hop into this. This is a topic that's very interesting, and doesn't seem like you can talk about education and not talk about early literacy kind of as being the foundation for that. So before we get into that, maybe just tell us a little bit about yourself.
I would love to do that. First to go to college in my family. I found my way to UT, and my dad would tell you that I just kept going to school because I was good at it, and got all 3 of my degrees from there. I went to Granger County Schools for a few years early on because teaching, there were a lot of teachers in Knoxville trying to vie for jobs.
Same story. I interned in Knox County, had to leave to come back, so you're right. Got it.
So made my way back to Knox County and spent 21 years here and had tons of opportunities, really learned a lot, had a lot of great mentors along the way. Like to think that maybe I had the opportunity to mentor some people, and then found my way to Middle Tennessee to be a school superintendent at a critical time when a lot of changes were happening in education. Had great experiences there, and got recruited to come to SCORE when it was a really small organization. Thought I'd go a year or two and then do something else, and found myself staying about 12 and a half years. But it was time to come back home. And loved what I was doing at SCORE, decided that, I'd invested in a lot of people there that could carry on the work, and I could come back to Knoxville, do some advising, and then get to invest a little bit more here locally. So
that's great. Well, we are glad you're here. One question we always ask for our students, they think, well, wow, she's a consultant, and she was born a consultant. Maybe just talk through how you are now a consultant, maybe working for SCORE, became a superintendent. None of those things seem like they were on your plate when you were probably in middle school or in high school. So maybe just talk a little bit about how, what was part of that decision making?
Yeah, thanks for asking. One of the things I've learned to do is say yes more than no. Now, there are a few times that I've said no to things that I felt like didn't fit with what my skills were or what I was really deeply interested in and that kind of thing. But I've always had the thought of, if someone thinks I can do it and I have a passion for it or an interest in it, and I think it can impact opportunities for students, and I'm going to give it a try, I can always do something else. Really, at first, thought thought I'd be a teacher. That's what I wanted to be. But my first or second year of teaching, which wasn't in Knox County, I thought, well, I can be a principal. I want to go back and learn how to be a principal. When I left the principalship, I was gunning for a staff development supervisor's job because I wanted to work with teachers. But my superintendent at the time had a different idea for me. And he said, no, I need you on my team and I need you supervising special education. And so I took the job and did that for a year. He decided to reorganize the staff. He wanted a deputy superintendent and asked me to do the administrative services job. And I really didn't feel like I was cut out for that. But he kept encouraging me and said, this will give you a broader view. So I took the job, and probably about 2/3 of the way through the year, or maybe not even that long, he came to me and said, the School Boards Association at the state level is doing a search for a superintendent in Lebanon, and I think you'd be perfect. He was an encourager, and he said, I will get you ready for that interview if they give you one. And he quizzed me. He brought in other team members to quiz me about different things. I went for the interview, and I drove home that night thinking, if they offer me this job, I'm going to go take it, because it sounded really exciting and like a great opportunity. And I went.
That's neat. I hear these themes for you, this whole kind of bloom where you're planted, do your best job in the job that you have. And then there's some courage and risk taking, but there's also that trust. You talk about mentorship. So many people sound like they kind of said, we see this in you. And I think that's so important. We challenge our staff to do that. Look at your students and help them see the future they may not see yet. Call that out. But the other part is you got to be willing to receive that and say, okay, I'll take that risk, or I'll trust that's going to happen. And obviously that's led you to some really great places.
Yeah, Dr. Roberts, I think that's great. When we come back, let's get into reading and more specifically literacy, the science behind that, and why that is so important. But for now, you're listening to The Education Blueprint with Dr. Jon Rysewyk. Coming up on The Education Blueprint.
In order for all students to crack the code, you have to teach them that letter-sound connection and how they can break a word down.
And later,
we do know predictively that 60% of students who aren't reading at a proficiency level by the 3rd grade will probably not graduate on time. Welcome back to the Education Blueprint. I'm Dr. Jon Rysewyk here with Dr. Sharon Roberts. We're going to get right into a topic I know you're passionate about. So
very much.
You've talked to us a little bit about you were a teacher, you were a principal, all the way up to a superintendent. There's a lot of things to focus on as an educator. So at what point did early literacy really stand out to you and you go, hey, this is critically important?
Thanks for that question. As I look back over my career, I taught special education first. And so it was important to me to go into a regular classroom setting at middle school level, taught science, taught reading. And I never could seem to, crack the code. I didn't understand why what I was doing wasn't working for all kids. And even as a principal, I remember one of the years early on, we adopted a new reading series. I, had some amazing teachers on staff that I knew had a skill set there, but still we weren't able to move the needle for kids. And I couldn't figure that out because we were following what everybody said was the right thing to do. And then went to Lebanon, different setting, and still saw some of the same challenges. And then a few years later, when I was at SCORE, there was a small group of superintendents that had kind of gotten together to talk about policy changes. But they enjoyed working together with each other so much that they said, well, let's work on a problem of practice. None of us have figured out how to move the needle on literacy. And they said, what if we put our heads together and tried to work on this? We, as a state and as a country, are at a critical place to make these changes because we know better now. And when you know better, you should do better.
That's good just for life in general, right? If we ever play so safe that we're never learning, then that's not good. So we're going to get out there, which might mean sometimes we make mistakes or have to think different. I always like to say we reserve the right to get smarter, right?
I heard the other day, we should think in draft and talk in draft because we're going to keep learning and change.
Well, let's unpack a little bit what you were talking about. In Knox County Schools, we have 4 priorities, and one of ours is excellence excellence in foundational
I
skills.
love that it is.
Really, we kind of call out two things there. Early literacy, kind of that third grade reading being a critical one. And we talk about the preparation for algebra as you get into math. But I think there's kind of three words that float around that. Our listeners may go, what do those really mean? Literacy and reading are two of those. But what is the difference?
Well, literacy is a much broader term, and it includes lots of different things. And it really is a national shift that's starting to happen. Let me tell you a little bit about the history, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So around the 1950s, for a while, there were the Dick and Jane books. Many of your listeners maybe remember those. If you go and look at those books, they're sight words. From Dick and Jane on, we went through a whole language period, which I call it the feel-good period, based on a belief that students shouldn't be distracted by those letter sounds, that's minutia, that instead we should be immersing them in literature, and they should have access to lots of books, and they should learn to love to read. Well, absolutely, we should immerse them in books and learn to love to read. But in order for all students to crack the code, you have to teach them that letter-sound connection and how they can break a word down. Unfortunately, during the time period where we weren't teaching explicit phonics, some children learned how to do it on their own. They figured it out. Other children didn't.
So Sharon, let me stop you right there. You've used two words, one being sight words and then one being phonics. And I think people have a general understanding of those, but maybe break those down for us a little bit.
So sight words are words that you can't sound out. People may be aware, and especially if you were taught to read this way, every consonant or vowel has a sound, like cat, C-A-T, cat. And a lot of the words in the English language you can sound out. There are some words that you can't, and they're what we call sight words. You just learn them. And a lot of the curriculum that is out now and has been for a time, they'll call them tricky words or nonsensical words. And so phonics is taking that and breaking that down.
So like when I hear you say those things, I'm much more a math science guy than I am a reading guy. I made the parallel to like a multiplication table. When you talk about like a sight word, I'm thinking about, 7 times 7 is 49.
Perfect
I may
example.
not know what the math is behind that, but I know just if I rote memory, see that enough, I just know, put it in my mind, it means 49. That's great because I know now when I see those two numbers together with an X between them, this is what it means. But I really don't understand the foundational skill. I can still have a ton of gaps until I learn how to break those numbers down and really what does 7 mean and 7 groups of 7 and all that kind of stuff. Then I can start using it for different things. So it sounds like early on there was a lot of just kind of more rote memory, exposure. And then there's this whole mechanical side of reading. Letters together make this sound, and you start memorizing that and practicing. I think about reading is the decoding some of that, but there's also like a written and speaking piece on this full literacy that I've got to know how to sound this out, because at some point we're going to move from 3-letter words to 15-letter words when we go to college, right? And so we have to be able to use those same skills to get there.
Now we have figured out that to teach reading and literacy, there are two components, and both are absolutely necessary. One is the foundational skills. Another segment called building knowledge is making sure you're helping students understand how things go together. All children don't come to school with the same experiences. And during this period of time when we were, not doing the foundational skills, we were focused on other skills like main idea or context clues, or cueing, which is kind of like guessing based on a picture that's there and maybe the first letter of the word or something like that. We were teaching those skills, working hard on those skills, and those weren't the right skills. We were not building knowledge. We were widening the gap. For the students who had those experiences that they could make connections to, excelled. The children who didn't couldn't read because they couldn't break the code of what was in front of them.
And I think you're right. I can remember having a spelling test at the end of every week. I didn't know anything about like what this letter meant and that letter. I just knew write it 15 times and then hopefully rewrite it again on Friday when you get to a test.
Parents of young kids will know those kids bring home maybe 10 sight words every week. If you learn the English language and how to read it 10 words at a time every week, it's going to take you forever.
But if you learn how to crack that code, spelling becomes a little
A lot
easier.
easier. When I go to classrooms now and I see that happening, kids actually sounding out, lots of times there's hand gestures with it, and I'm just going, wow, they can put syllables together. They're really learning the mechanics of that.
And what's interesting, I think you kind of answered this, was coming into this, I wanted to ask you, my parents, they learned how to read. I learned how to read. And my kids are learning how to read. Why does this keep evolving? Something worked, but it sounds like what you're saying is that it worked to a certain extent.
Yes.
But it didn't work for everybody. And a lot of people got left behind in a lot of areas because it didn't work the way they needed it to.
In 2007, the state got an F in false advertising. We were telling parents and community members and that kind of thing that our students were doing really, really well on the state assessments. But when we looked at national assessments, they weren't doing so well. So we started changing things. We upped the rigor on the standards and all that. But what we hadn't done was across the state or country, we hadn't provided the high quality instructional materials to align with those high standards. And we hadn't then helped teachers change their constructs of how they teach literacy in a good way, in a way that will move the needle for all kids.
Okay, so when we come back, let's talk about how the way my kids are learning to read is different than how their grandparents and I learned to read, and how we figured out that it's actually what we should have been doing all along. This is the Education Blueprint with Dr. Jon Rysewyk.
Coming up on the Education Blueprint.
We always like to say we reserve the right to get smarter. And as we figure these things out, we have to do better. So Sharon, reading instruction has changed in recent years. And now we talk a lot about the science of reading. They're using that in all of the universities now, and that's how our teachers are trained to be much more effective. As you said, we've gotten smarter at understanding how to do that. So in just simple terms, what is the science of reading?
The science of reading, very simply put, is two strands. First, it's letter-sound association, so kids can learn how to break down words and be able to sound them out. And secondly, it's building knowledge and making sure that students can make connections to be able to go deep on individual topics, but also have a broader span of things that they're knowledgeable about so that they can make connections through the years.
So, Dr. Roberts, the science of reading became accepted practice. Can you talk about at what point did the state of Tennessee decide to take it on?
The state had been focused on literacy for a number of years. They'd been through a few iterations, and the state, from my view, was very poised to enact a literacy policy, state policy. The legislators were talking about it, and of course, COVID happened. And when the legislature came back in 2021, they were really focused on two things. How do we improve literacy across our state? And then secondly, what they were looking at is learning loss acceleration. And so the 2021 legislation codifies what we're going to do as Tennessee. It supports this systematic approach, especially for K through 3 or even pre-K through 3, systematic approach to teaching phonics, and then also building the students' background knowledge and their vocabulary, that we're going to spend at least 30 minutes a day with those children in the classrooms. We're helping them unpack that code. It also calls out and codifies the 5 components of literacy, which is phonemic awareness, and that's things like rhyming, oral rhyming of words. We all practiced and did some of that as we were growing up. Phonics, that's breaking that code, learning to read. And then fluency. We all want to be able to read at a speed that we can keep up with, and vocabulary, and then comprehension. All of those components are in what we call the science of reading.
Yeah, I'm glad we work in a state that was willing to do that hard work. They were willing to say, it's not working. Let's establish a baseline. Let's see what really does work. And then to see that adopted across our state. Shifting gears a little bit, another place that I think our state has done great work, really this concept of proficiency. We see these state scores that come out, and everyone looks to see what percentage of kids were proficient. I remember a time when we were at the upper 80s and 90% proficiencies, and now our fourth grade is at 50% right now. I'd like for you to talk to that a little bit. Just that understanding that we do have high standards in Tennessee, and to be proficient is quite an accomplishment.
Yeah, let me just jump in there and ask specifically about what it means to be proficient and why it matters so much in the third grade specifically, since it seemed to be the focus of state legislation.
I go back to an expression that I don't know who coined it, but, up until third grade, we're learning to read. And then after third grade, we're reading to learn. So as you say, it gets harder as we go on through the years. And so, I love that we look back across Republican governors, Democratic governors who said, this isn't acceptable. We're going to do something about this. Focus on making sure that we have high standards for our students, because all students have the ability to learn. So as you mentioned, proficiency is difficult in our state. It doesn't mean that if a student doesn't show up as proficient, that they can't do some of the skills or that they can't read. It just means that they're less likely to be able to go to deep levels as they move through their educational career. Reading complexity gets harder as they go on. And if they're struggling at the end of third grade, they're going to continue to struggle.
Third grade's so important. How the curriculum's designed, there's almost an assumption after third grade that you know how to read. So if you don't know how to read, that gap's going to widen really quick as students start progressing.
I think also the distinction is it's curriculum across the board.
Great point,
Math,
Brandon.
word problems, science, all these students have to start doing the work at home, doing it on their own. And yeah, it's not just reading anymore. Everything speeds up.
We've got years of data that show that when students aren't able to be proficient at third grade, they're going to have more trouble at fourth grade, more trouble at fifth grade, and on as the reading the reading gets tougher for them.
Recent scores that just came out, we are starting to see we're in the we were in the 40s, now we're in the 20s. Like we're moving into that top half.
Top 10 in the country.
Which is amazing. The growth level
I
that's
didn't
happened.
think it would happen in my career, and I'm so excited.
It's so great to see. We've seen the same here in Knox County. We've surpassed the numbers we had pre-COVID, so it is working. It's important to know that standard is very high in the state of Tennessee, and we are continuing to advance. I would say not fast enough, and it's still there 50% in Knoxville that aren't there yet, and we'll continue to work on those interventions to get them there. But I feel good that it means something to be proficient. And even if your student is approaching, which is the category right below that, that doesn't mean we're going to hold this student back, right? That means that we need to start working on trying to figure out how to get those interventions to make that happen.
I think this might actually be a good place to pause for just a second. When we come back, I want to hear from you, Dr. Rysewyk, a little bit about what this looks like on the ground in Knox County Schools, some of the concepts that Dr. Roberts is talking about. But for now, you're listening to The Education Blueprint
With Dr. Jon Rysewyk.
Still to come on The Education Blueprint.
Targeted interventions has been an important part of what we've done too. What do you do if they're not? We can assess and know where a student is, but if they're not achieving at that level, we don't just teach it louder, right? We have to do something different.
Welcome back to The Education Blueprint with Dr. Jon Rysewyk. All right, Dr. Rysewyk, our most recent annual report showed Knox County third and fourth grade English Language Arts, or ELA, scores have been higher than the state of Tennessee since 2021. So I guess the question then is, how did we get here?
Prince, that's a great question. It was great to hear some of the state, how they've been very intentional over the last decade. We tried to mirror some of that too in our district, to be real intentional. How do we boil things down? And how do we make it simple so that our classroom teachers can understand it, our parents can understand it, our students can understand it? You got to establish a baseline first. And for us, that was our literacy landscape analysis that we did. It was an 8-week period. We brought in a third party that came in and looked at all 52 of our elementary schools and really looked at them from things like, did teachers understand? Because again, we can have something on paper. Here are our literacy goals as a district, right? But did teachers understand, internalize those literacy goals, and did we see evidence of that in their classroom, that they were actually doing that? Also, were the high quality instructional materials being used? Our board has invested over the last 3 years millions of dollars in trying to get those grade level materials for all grades and all students. Are they being used? We realize you can adopt, but then how do you really teach people how to use all of those materials and all of those things? So we look for that. The effectiveness of teaching practices and assessment is part of that. And I know we think about end of the year assessments all the time and, kids stopping and testing. That's not what this is. This is an assessment that's done quickly, 10, 15 minutes. There's spot checks throughout so that we can reorganize students and put them in a different group if that one's not working so they don't fall further behind. And then just the engagement of principals, teachers, and students. What we know, and we say all the time, the leader is so critical. They're understanding, how do they make room in that master schedule? What do they talk about in their staff meetings? things. What data do they share? All that stuff's critical too. So we began there with just that level of analysis over 8 weeks. Those results were given to individual schools so they could write those into their school improvement plans for this year. They were given to those regional teams so they knew how to have checkpoints throughout this year moving forward to see how those things were working for them. And then also to know how our team can come in and support if there are gaps that they have or that the principal feels that they have. Really working with our team, build out an instructional framework that talks a lot about the science of reading, making sure that our practices are aligned to that, making sure that we have that high quality instructional material in every classroom. Just the importance of that grade level exposure. Even if kids aren't performing at grade level, they still need that exposure or they fall further behind. And then really targeted interventions has been an important part of what we've done too. You know, what do you do if they're not? We can assess and know where a student is, but if they're not achieving at that level, you know, we don't just teach it louder, right? We have to do something different. And that means we have to have interventions that are aligned to that. We've always done interventions, but now the fact that there is a little more coherence in what we're seeing across there.
And John, I'd love to compliment you guys on what you're doing in that space too, because it's one of those things where a lot of us who've been in education for a long time in the last, little bit have thought, why didn't we think of this before? And that is, now that we know what we know and that all students should be exposed to grade level instruction, and parents, if you're listening, you may hear teachers say tier 1 instruction. That's one of those education terms we use a lot. But we've always, and I did it over and over again, we would have maybe tutoring for students who were further behind or were struggling with some concept. We'd pull them, or they'd be in maybe another part of the room with another adult in the room that's helping them, but we'd give them different materials. And then if you're even further behind, well, we'll give you even different materials from that. But the teacher was still working with the students who were working on grade level sometimes in those situations. And if I'm further behind and I don't know what she's talking about in class, but you pull me for this other group and I'm doing something completely different, then I'm behind over here. And so we just inadvertently created this disconnect for children who are already behind. And so now we've gotten smarter and we've said if we want all students exposed to that, then how do we give them more times at bat with the materials that they're using in the classroom? And as you mentioned, SCORE really got invested in this topic a year or two ago when we saw some data of how if some districts just tried those materials with children who were in special education or who were receiving tutoring services or some other pull-out program for that, we saw that their data, those students did better than the students who were working with alternative materials. And so we started with a pilot with you guys and some other districts. You guys really engaged in this, and we invested with you a second year as a school district, and you're going deeper in it, and we're excited to see what the results are from that work and help you tell that story even more so that we can continue to learn as a state.
Well, that's been great work for us too, and again, we always like it's great to have research hot off the press so that we can try to implement that, and that's been great. I say two other areas that we've continued to work intentionally on. One is our investment in pre-K. What we know is that waiting till kindergarten is too late to start worrying about learning to read and those sorts of things. So our boards continue to invest in pre-K. We've opened 2 standalone pre-Ks. We continue, especially in our center city schools, to have a commitment over the next 5 years to offer more and more seats for students who need that exposure. And it's always great for my heart to go to Fair Garden, one of our pre-Ks, and also to like a Moreland Heights, just to see the quality of what's going on instructionally. When I see kids in there working on phonics, sounding out words like in 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, actually reading words. They've done all the pre-work practice on those foundational skills on the front side. I walk into a room like that and I go, those kids are going to be proficient. I know we don't test them till 3rd grade, but they're going to be kindergarten ready. I've seen a commitment too in our K2. All of those teachers, we've done a lot of work with them as well, but their focus on understanding the importance of that, back to that belief in the science of reading, what needs to happen. So I think we're just scratching the surface of where we're going to go with that. And I would say a final place we've been intentional is really back to that intervention that we're talking about. And especially trying to carve out and look at master schedules. There is a response to instruction and intervention, RTI, that we talk about a lot that's required by the state. That is actually for students who fall in certain percentages that get a 30-minute or 40-minute time per day where they're working on those reading skills. And we did last year spent time with our team looking at making sure there was room in those master schedules for kids to get those. And just in looking at that, we saw over 2,000 kids more are now receiving 3 hours of additional instruction per week. So, we go back to that importance of that principal and that leader in that school, and also that alignment of those resources that you've talked about, Sharon. Some of that is instructional materials. Some of that's also time on task and how we build those master schedules. So all of these things we think will yield to even greater outcomes for students. So we're being very intentional about those things and then continuing to learn.
John, what I would add there is that, through this work over the last few years, your data is bearing that out. There's still lots of room for improvement in every single school district across the state. We're continuing to learn more. But what I'm pleased with and excited about is there are demonstrably more students leading up to third grade and in third grade and in fourth grade who are getting supports and resources, and their teachers too, for helping them do this work. I can remember so many teachers back in my past wanting to make referrals to special education because they had done everything they knew to do to help that child. And now we're actually, as a system, giving teachers more tools in their toolbox and giving students more times at bat to learn so that they can excel, and approaching it at young age with children. And I love hearing what you're talking about with the preschoolers and that kind of thing. Warms my heart to see those kinds of things happening.
Well, it's important work. It's important work for the district, and again, we're seeing the results for the students, and that's what we're in it for.
Dr. Roberts, you mentioned that the state has taken a particular interest in this third grade reading proficiency. I remember a couple years ago, they actually passed a law about third grade retention. For both of you, whether it's Knox County Schools or statewide, what did that do to how things operate in this space?
Yeah, I'll jump in on that one. There was a lot of nervousness. There was a lot of concern about, are we going to have, extremely large fourth grade classes? Are people going to pull their kids to homeschool or to, different kind of where they're not held by what this law is? And, I can remember having conversations with some of the legislators as that was rolling around. And the conversations they had with me was, it's been 10 years and we haven't seen much movement. And they felt like at that point they needed to get involved. My stance at that point was what we need is the funding dollars for the interventions, and we're willing to start those early on. What we saw as the net of that is that we've seen fewer than 50 students actually be retained in Knox County, which I think has really calmed people a lot. I do think what it did do, though, was it really put a spotlight on kind of birth to third grade and what happens in that. Which falls in again with our commitment to pre-K and really starting that early. I think for K-2 teachers who always have done a good job, and there was this kind of heightened about what do we need to be doing in the early literacy space. A lot of it was that proactive instruction that we started seeing in the K-2 grades, understanding how high those stakes were. A lot of it were the interventions. We've spoken a little bit of that about this, how that being aligned to the high quality instructional materials and really that commitment at every school level every day to make sure that's happening and kids are getting what they're needing. And then also, this is where some of the state funding came in. We did have the summer learning camps that are requirements for students who score in third grade at certain levels. But it's about a month long where they get just reading instruction and intervention for that full time. And then also with that tutoring. I mean, there was a lot of research, especially coming out of the pandemic, around the power of that low ratio, high dosage tutoring, and it was very specific what it needed to be about and what it needed to do. We did a lot of that in Knox County. There were a lot of nonprofits who also picked up on that, but just really working through giving students individually what they need. And now, again, the state came back with two things. One is students attend that summer learning camp. They can move on to fourth grade, or if they have a tutor in fourth grade that continues to help them along and make those gains. And so I think the supports are all there for it. I think it would have been a different situation if the supports hadn't been there, but they are, and they continue to work well for us, and our teachers and our schools continue to implement those well. So I do think there's been definitely a heightened awareness of the importance of what needs to happen in early literacy.
I agree with you, Jon. From, a state view and looking at it, there'd been something on the books since 2012. And so you made the comment that when you talked with the legislators that you talked with, they said, well, it's been on the books for 10 years and we haven't seen anything. That makes sense. They really hadn't seen a movement. People refer to the third grade retention as being the literacy law. It actually, I want to clarify that and say it's not part of the literacy law. It was part of the learning acceleration legislation that came out at that time. But I will say that no matter what people's feelings were about it, now we're a couple of years away from that, just like you said. You didn't see that many students who actually were retained in the end. Across the state, when we look, there's not a huge number of students that were retained in the end, but it caused parents, it caused school districts, educators, policymakers at all levels to realize we do need to be looking early on. And we have the structures and processes in place now, codified, the responsibilities of districts to make sure that they're providing those high quality instructional materials. And as you said, that law also came with funding to districts. And a requirement that you have to do summer learning and you have to do tutoring for students at 3rd and 4th grade. Some districts chose to do other grades and other configurations and investments and that type of thing based on the way they could do it. And I commend you all for doing that because you had to turn on a dime and do those things. And I worried how hard that was going to be. But you did what you always do, which is step up for kids, doing what's required of you by law, but also doing what you think is going to really help your students move and supporting your teachers across the way. And I love how you called out that you really focused on teachers and their skills at those lower levels. I can remember back through the years, and I pause and I worry about saying this because I love teachers, and they've been my life work, and I see myself as a teacher. But sometimes teachers would want to move through my career, I'll just say my career, to maybe lower grade levels because it was a non-tested grade. And that's shifted now. We can't hide or we can't go someplace. It matters, every grade that you are. And I love that teachers and educators across our state is embracing that knowledge because it's all going to help our students in the end. And we're going to get better as we continue on this journey.
Thank you for that, Dr. Roberts. All right, let's take a quick pause. And then I'd like to hear from Dr. Roberts about what parents can do to support their child's literacy. For now, though, you're listening to The Education Blueprint with Dr. Jon Rysewyk. Still to come,
find out what they're learning about in their reading class or in their science class or something out, and ask them specific questions about what did you learn about XYZ today.
Welcome back to the Education Blueprint with Dr. Jon Rysewyk. Something that I wanted to mention was having kids that go through elementary school in the state of Tennessee, just the advantage that we have in terms of early literacy and reading to have the Imagination Library in Dolly Parton where every child under 5 gets a book a month. That is amazing. You can't imagine the amount of books that you get from the Imagination Library to supplement your own library, and it really does make a huge difference. But for other young parents out there that have kids that aren't yet in elementary school and kids that are in elementary school, what could you say to them, Dr. Roberts, that they could supplement their school education, their daycare education with?
Well, I love that you brought up the Imagination Library and the work that Dolly Parton and her foundation has done. And I commend the Governor's Early Literacy Foundation for carrying that work forward. They've actually tried to take that even into the early grades and working with school districts and that kind of thing, and are being very innovative in their thinking. And as I think about parents of young children, I'd love to share a personal story. One of my goddaughters that lives in Nashville. The most recent time that I was in to visit, she's 3 years old, And she is very articulate and very smart and fun and funny. And she loves books and she loves to learn. A summer or so ago, the cicadas were out. I was a science teacher, John, in 6th grade for a while, but I'm not a creepy crawly kind of girl. I'm not crazy about those things. And she loves cicadas because her dad taught her about cicadas. For bedtime, she likes to read or have her mom or me read to her about cicadas with pictures and words and vocabulary that I have to use my foundational skills to sound out. She has a deep knowledge about cicadas that I care not to have. But that is an example of what parents can do with their children. When children find something that they're interested in, it doesn't matter what the reading level of that is. If the child is motivated by it, then read it. I mean, she would prefer reading those at bedtime to her princess books, even though she loves princesses and that type of thing. Learning with young children, it is there. It happens no matter what, their excitement about it. Find out what motivates them and give them every opportunity for that. The other thing I would just suggest with regard to parents at all levels is learn more about this topic. Talk with your child's teacher. Talk with the principal. Learn what's happening in the schools and ask questions about it. As an educator, I hated it when parents would say, I asked my child, well, what'd you learn today? Or what'd you do in school today? And you know, the typical answer, especially when I taught middle school, was nothing. Don't ask that. Find out what they're learning about in their reading class or in their science class or something out, and ask them specific questions about what did you learn about X, Y, Z today. Tell me what your teacher taught you. Tell me what you did with your peers in the classroom.
Yeah, I'll jump in there to back that up. As somebody with 3 middle schoolers, asking about their friends first is a great way to get that conversation started. That's a really great hack, Dr. Roberts. John?
Well, I want to thank you for being here today, and I want to thank you just for your 21 years in Knox County Schools and what you did. Thank you for your work at the state level to kind of say how can we do better things for kids. And I love your continued commitment to consult and continue going. This is what works for kids. I just really appreciate that passion and commitment that you have. And thanks for being here today.
Thanks, John. I've enjoyed it so much.
As we come back to frame excellence in public education, thinking about what Dr. Roberts said and what you've talked about and what people have heard on and on for the past couple years about 3rd grade reading proficiency, it is in fact quantifiable that this is a predictive kind of thing. Like there is a reason why 3rd grade is so important and what happens after that.
Yeah, it totally is. I think, Prentice, we've talked a lot about intentionality. We've talked a lot about alignment. You'll hear that a lot when I talk about things. And I think 3rd grade reading does tie straight to another initiative that we have is the 865 Academies. We talk about the function of our school system. The main reason we exist is to prepare students for life after graduation. Well, one of our priorities is excellence in foundational skills. That has to come first, and that's what we're talking about here when we talk about 3rd grade reading. If you don't get that mastered, you're going to struggle to do our other one, which is career empowerment and preparation, right? So there is intentionality in our steps to this. When you look at some of the data around that, we do know predictively that 60% of students who aren't reading at a proficiency level by the 3rd grade will probably not graduate on time. That's a big deal. So, it's talking about how important that is for that to happen so that they have that chance to enlist, enroll, or be employed when they leave. So that's why we have so much energy focused in on that. We also talk about earning potential. That really starts back in the kindergarten through 3rd grade. If you were to drop out of high school, we see about a $10,000 to $15,000 less per year that you can earn on a salary, over $200,000 over that lifetime than peers who actually have that high school diploma. We're thinking beyond diploma right now, but let's just go back to that basic. Everything takes steps. You've got to be proficient in reading. You've got to earn that high school diploma. It has an impact all the way back to kindergarten, 1st and 2nd grade of what you could do long term.
Yeah, incredibly important. Dr. Roberts also mentioned, and I think you did as well, high quality instructional materials. As a parent, when I hear that, I think, well, I hope that they all are high quality instructional materials, but this is an actual term that's come to be a thing in recent years. Explain to me what it actually means.
Yeah, another education term you think about is it the quality of the paper and the photos, right? Like
Yeah.
probably a better way to say that. It really, I think of three things that we're talking about. When we talk about high quality instructional material, we've always had materials and textbooks and all those sorts of things. But what we're talking about is grade level. We talked a lot about proficiency with Dr. Roberts and just that high demand, that high rigor, that high bar to meet. And so in order to do that, you've got to be exposed to grade level text, no matter if it's your science classroom, your reading classroom, at all times. So that's one component of high quality instructional material. The second would be that we talked a little bit about that context gap. When you're talking about reading, students have different exposures to different things. So a high quality instructional material sets a high bar, grade level, but then also has a diverse group of settings and readings. There might be something about the beach. There might also be something about a sport. There might be something about a historic figure. So it's really trying to build that knowledge base for all students. We know students come from different backgrounds, have different experiences, and a high-quality instructional material will expose students to multiple things to really gain that base knowledge kind of the world around them. That's important. And then the third thing it does is it really allows for consistency. When you've got individual people who are picking things daily in their classroom, everyone's got their favorites, everyone's got their strengths and their weaknesses. What this does is allows consistency across the board to make sure it's grade level, to make sure it is taking care of all that contextual background, and that everyone's getting exposed. Whether you go to school A or school B, you're getting that same exposure to that high level. So all those things are baked into that term, high quality instructional material.
Something else that jumped out at me that she was talking about, and you as well, something that Knox County Schools has been doing for the past few years that is a new concept, was if kids get pulled, the regular educational setting, that where they are working on, that extra support, those extra tutoring sessions, whatever it may be, they're working with the same material as the other kids that are still in class. That's one of those things that you look back on and you think, well, why weren't we always doing that? But it's, hindsight's 20/20.
Yeah.
Talk to me about how that idea kind of developed.
I would say it's like going to the doctor, right? So you go, you have high blood pressure, your body system all works together. That's why they talk about it. Are you getting exercise? What diet are you eating? All those things flow into that. You don't treat things in silos, right? And the same thing's true when it comes to reading. I have this material I'm using in my classroom, and then if I go away and it's totally different terminology, different processes, then it feels like I'm in a whole different class. And it's hard for a student to make that connection back to what I just did in my reading class to what I just did in this intervention. So part of that was just streamlining that to go, it all makes sense. It's going to be based off the same material. It's going to be based off the same things, maybe the same story, maybe the same context, and sometimes, but it's going to be something that kids can make that connection to quickly, and it doesn't feel like they're learning something new. So I think that's really important. And, it's that whole thing of why didn't we figure this out sooner? I think that's the great thing about education, like that continuous improvement mindset that you have to bring every day. Like, we're always learners. We always like to say we reserve the right to get smarter. And as we figure these things out, we have to do better.
We owe a big thanks to Dogwood Elementary for allowing us to sit in on a reading lesson. And a special thanks to KCS Executive Director of Learning and Literacy, Dr. Aaron Phillips, and Early Childhood Education Supervisor, Beth Lackey. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it and follow and subscribe to the Education Blueprint with Dr. Jon Rysewyk for easy access to all our newest content. And if you can, leave us a review. It really helps others find the show. The Education Blueprint with Dr. Jon Rysewyk is a production of Knox County Schools and hosted by Dr. Jon Rysewyk with me, Prentice Elliott. Our team also includes Knox County Schools Assistant Superintendent of Strategy, Corey Lautner, KCS Creative Services Supervisor, Abby Harris, and KCS Executive Director of Public Affairs, Carly Harrington. Kaylee Walker coordinates promotion at Knox Schools on Facebook, X, and Instagram. Our cover art was designed by Justin Johnson.